Marshal Karl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim stood in his headquarters bunker at Mikkeli on the morning of November 30th, 1939, reviewing intelligence reports indicating that Soviet forces totaling approximately 450,000 troops, supported by over 2,000 tanks and 1,000 aircraft, were crossing Finland's eastern border at multiple points along 1,000-kilometer front, stretching from Arctic Ocean in north to Gulf of Finland in south, massive invasion force implementing Stalin's plan to conquer Finland in matter of weeks, through overwhelming application of Soviet military power against nation of less than 4 million people, fielding maximum of 180,000 defenders with minimal armor or air support. Mannerheim, veteran of Imperial Russian Army, who had fought in Russo-Japanese War and World War I before becoming Finland's military leader, understood immediately that conventional defensive strategy emphasizing static positions would fail against Soviet numerical superiority, that Finnish survival depended on exploiting advantages of terrain, climate, and defensive preparation while implementing mobile tactics that would offset Soviet advantages in numbers and material. The Soviet invasion plan called for breakthrough attacks against Mannerheim Line fortifications on Karelian Isthmus north of Leningrad, simultaneous advances through central Finland toward strategically important targets, and amphibious operations to seize Finnish coastal positions that would allow Soviet control of Gulf of Finland. Soviet commanders anticipated quick victory based on overwhelming force superiority, expecting Finnish resistance to collapse within 2 or 3 weeks. Once Soviet mechanized forces penetrated defensive lines, and Finnish army found itself unable to contest Soviet air superiority or match Soviet artillery firepower. The Soviet assessment severely underestimated Finnish defensive capabilities, Finnish national determination to resist invasion, and challenges that Finnish terrain and Arctic winter conditions would create for Soviet operations designed around mechanized warfare, emphasizing speed and firepower over adaptation to local conditions. The temperature across much of Finland on November 30th hovered around -20 degrees Celsius, relatively moderate for Finnish winter, but cold enough to create immediate challenges for Soviet forces that had not received adequate cold weather equipment or training for Arctic operations, despite obvious fact that invasion was scheduled for onset of winter when temperatures would inevitably drop far below freezing. Soviet BT-7 fast tanks and T-26 light tanks leading mechanized columns discovered quickly that Finnish roads were inadequate for heavy military traffic. Narrow forest tracks forcing tanks to advance in single file, vulnerable to ambush, frozen ground limiting cross-country mobility, and complete absence of suitable defensive positions along narrow roads, meaning that damaged or immobilized vehicles blocked entire columns, preventing maneuver by following forces. The Mannerheim Line defending Karelian Isthmus represented Finland's most heavily fortified defensive position, concrete bunkers and anti-tank obstacles covering 65 kilometers of terrain between Lake Ladoga and Gulf of Finland. Defensive works designed to channel Soviet attacks into killing zones where Finnish artillery and infantry could engage massed Soviet formations with devastating effect. The fortifications, while substantial, were far less extensive than Maginot Line or other major European defensive systems, Finnish limited resources and peacetime construction constraints having prevented construction of defense in depth that might have withstood sustained Soviet assault. Despite these limitations, the Mannerheim Line represented formidable obstacle that Soviet forces would need to overcome through direct assault against prepared positions where Finnish defenders enjoyed every advantage except numerical superiority and heavy weapons support. Soviet 7th Army under General Vsevolod Yakovlev, attacking across Karelian Isthmus, employed standard Soviet assault tactics, emphasizing massed artillery preparation followed by tank infantry attacks designed to overwhelm defensive positions through sheer weight of firepower and numbers. The Soviet artillery bombardment preceding infantry assaults included participation of heavy guns capable of penetrating concrete fortifications, thousands of shells impacting Finnish positions in preparatory fires intended to suppress defenders and destroy strongpoints before Soviet infantry advanced to occupy positions. Finnish defenders, sheltering in bunkers and trenches, endured hours of Soviet bombardment. Casualties from artillery fire remaining relatively light, given protection provided by concrete and earth fortifications, though psychological impact of sustained shelling created stress that wore on troops who had to remain under cover, unable to respond until Soviet infantry came within range of Finnish weapons. The Soviet BT-7 fast tanks supporting infantry assaults on Mannerheim Line discovered that Finnish anti-tank defenses were more effective than Soviet intelligence had suggested. Concrete dragon's teeth obstacles channeling tanks along predictable routes where Finnish anti-tank guns could engage them at close range, mines destroying vehicles that attempted to bypass obstacles, and Molotov cocktails thrown by Finnish infantry proving devastatingly effective against tanks whose gasoline engines ignited easily when struck by burning petrol bombs. The BT-7, with its Christie suspension and relatively light armor, had been designed for high-speed operations on roads, rather than for breakthrough attacks against fortified positions. Thin armor vulnerable to Finnish 37mm anti-tank guns, and even to heavy machine gun fire at close range, making unsupported tank attacks against prepared positions suicidal missions that resulted in heavy Soviet armor losses without achieving breakthrough objectives. Finnish ski troops operating behind Soviet lines represented unique military capability that Soviet forces had not encountered in previous operations. Soldiers wearing white winter camouflage and equipped with skis allowing rapid cross-country movement through snow-covered forests, where Soviet mechanized forces were confined to roads and tracks. These Finnish ski patrols appeared suddenly from forest to attack Soviet supply columns, ambush isolated Soviet units, cut communications lines, and disappear back into wilderness before Soviet forces could organize effective response. Hit-and-run tactics that disrupted Soviet logistics and created constant insecurity among Soviet rear-area troops, who never knew when Finnish raiders might strike next. The psychological impact of these attacks exceeded their tactical significance, Soviet soldiers developing fear of Finnish ghost soldiers, who materialized from snow and vanished without trace, perception that Finns could move invisibly through winter landscape, creating anxiety that degraded Soviet morale and combat effectiveness. The Battle of Suomussalmi in central Finland, beginning in early December, represented watershed moment in winter war when Finnish forces demonstrated ability not just to defend against Soviet attacks, but to conduct offensive operations that destroyed entire Soviet divisions through encirclement and annihilation. Soviet 163rd Rifle Division, advancing toward Suomussalmi village, became strung out along narrow forest road with limited ability to deploy off-road into dense forest and deep snow, formation presenting perfect target for Finnish Motti tactics that emphasized cutting Soviet columns into isolated segments that could be destroyed piecemeal. Colonel Hjalmar Silasvuo, commanding Finnish forces at Suomussalmi, recognized vulnerability of extended Soviet column and organized attacks that severed road at multiple points, isolating Soviet units from each other and from their supply bases, trapping thousands of Soviet soldiers in frozen forest without adequate food, fuel, or ammunition to sustain operations or break out from Finnish encirclement. The Soviet 44th Rifle Division, sent to relieve 163rd Division at Suomussalmi, met similar fate. Finnish forces employing same Motti tactics to cut division into isolated segments trapped on frozen roads surrounded by Finnish troops, who conducted systematic destruction of each pocket through combination of direct assault and artillery fire. The temperature during Suomussalmi battles dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. Soviet troops inadequately equipped for Arctic conditions, suffering severe frostbite and cold injuries, while attempting to maintain defensive positions in snow-covered forest without proper winter clothing or heated shelters. Finnish troops accustomed to winter conditions and properly equipped with warm clothing and skis maintained combat effectiveness despite extreme cold. Ability to operate in conditions that debilitated Soviet forces, providing Finnish tactical advantage that partially offset Soviet numerical superiority. Finnish artillery supporting defensive operations consisted primarily of 76 mm field guns and 105 mm howitzers, relatively light weapons compared to Soviet heavy artillery, but adequate for direct fire against Soviet tanks at close range and for indirect fire missions against Soviet troop concentrations identified by forward observers. The Finnish gunners developed techniques for engaging Soviet armor at ranges under 500 meters, where even light field guns could penetrate Soviet tank armor, ambush tactics that allowed Finnish artillery to engage Soviet columns from concealed positions and then displace before Soviet counter-battery fire could respond. One particularly effective engagement at Kollaa saw Finnish 76 mm guns destroy over 20 Soviet tanks in single engagement. Soviet armor advancing along narrow road directly into pre-sighted kill zone, where Finnish artillery engaged at point-blank range with devastating results that littered road with burning Soviet vehicles, blocking advance of following forces. The Soviet T-26 light tanks that formed bulk of Soviet armored forces proved particularly vulnerable to Finnish defensive tactics. Two-man turret with 45 mm gun, providing reasonable firepower, but thin armor offering minimal protection against Finnish anti-tank weapons at combat ranges typical of forest warfare, where engagements occurred at hundreds rather than thousands of meters. The T-26's gasoline engine made vehicles susceptible to fire when hit by Molotov cocktails or incendiary ammunition, numerous T-26s brewing up after relatively minor damage ignited fuel tanks or engine compartments. The Finnish troops coined term Molotov cocktail during Winter War, improvised petrol bombs named sarcastically after Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, who had claimed that Soviet bombers dropping on Helsinki were delivering food aid rather than explosives. Finnish infantry employing these simple but effective weapons to destroy Soviet armor by targeting engine compartments and fuel tanks, where burning petrol could penetrate into vehicle interior. Soviet air operations supporting ground forces included I-16 fighter aircraft and SB-2 bomber aircraft, operating from bases near Leningrad. Soviet bombers conducting strategic bombing raids against Finnish cities, including Helsinki, while fighters provided air cover for ground operations and conducted ground attack missions against Finnish defensive positions. The Soviet air attacks on Finnish cities achieved limited military results, but created significant civilian casualties and property damage. Bombing of Helsinki on November 30th, resulting in destruction of residential areas and creating international condemnation of Soviet tactics that targeted civilian population centers. Finnish air defense against Soviet bombing relied primarily on anti-aircraft artillery and limited number of obsolescent fighters, including Fokker DX-6V biplanes and early-model Bristol Blenheim bombers, modified for fighter role. Finnish pilots achieving impressive kill ratios against superior Soviet numbers through aggressive tactics and exploitation of Soviet formations' vulnerability to hit-and-run attacks. The temperature across Finland continued dropping through December and January, reaching -43 degrees Celsius in some areas. Extreme cold that challenged both Finnish and Soviet forces, but affected Soviet troops more severely due to inadequate winter equipment and lack of training for Arctic operations. Soviet tank crews discovered that engines would not start after sitting overnight in -40-degree temperatures without continuous operation or external heating, lubricants freezing solid and fuel becoming too viscous to flow through lines, creating situations where entire Soviet armored formations sat immobilized on frozen roads, unable to advance or retreat, while Finnish forces maneuvered around paralyzed columns. The Soviet infantry suffered even more severely from cold. Soldiers lacking proper winter clothing, developing severe frostbite on exposed extremities. Many Soviet casualties resulting from cold exposure, rather than combat injuries, as troops inadequately prepared for Arctic warfare succumbed to hypothermia during operations in conditions where survival required constant attention to maintaining body heat. The Battle of Kollaa in December and January became legendary in Finnish military history. Single Finnish regiment under Colonel Paavo Talvela, holding defensive position against sustained Soviet attacks by forces outnumbering defenders by more than 10 to 1. Finnish troops maintaining position through 2 months of continuous combat despite heavy casualties and constant Soviet pressure. The Finnish defenders at Kollaa employed tactics that maximized defensive advantages of terrain and preparation while minimizing exposure to Soviet firepower superiority, small unit counterattacks disrupting Soviet assault preparations, artillery fire breaking up Soviet concentrations before they could organize attacks, and individual Finnish soldiers inflicting disproportionate casualties through accurate rifle fire and effective use of automatic weapons against massed Soviet formations. The legendary Finnish sniper, Simo Heiha, operating near Kollaa area, achieved over 500 confirmed eliminations using standard-issue Mosin Nagant rifle without telescopic sight. Extraordinary marksmanship combined with patience and fieldcraft making Heiha most effective individual combatant of entire war and symbol of Finnish determination to resist Soviet invasion regardless of odds. Marshal Mannerheim's defensive strategy emphasized elastic defense that traded space for time, allowing Soviet forces to advance into killing zones where Finnish counterattacks could isolate and destroy extended Soviet formations, while maintaining Finnish main defensive lines intact for sustained resistance. This approach required Finnish forces to accept temporary Soviet penetrations of defensive positions, strategic patience allowing tactical withdrawals that lured Soviet forces into vulnerable positions rather than attempting to hold every meter of ground through costly static defense. The Mannerheim Line on Karelian Isthmus remained primary defensive position that could not be abandoned without conceding vital territory, but elsewhere, Finnish forces practiced mobile defense that frustrated Soviet attempts to bring superior numbers and firepower to bear decisively against Finnish main forces that refused to remain in fixed positions where Soviet artillery could destroy them. Soviet T-28 medium tanks participating in breakthrough attempts against Mannerheim Line represented more formidable threat than lighter BT-7 and T-26 models. 3-turret design with 70 V6mm main gun in central turret, and 2 machine gun turrets providing better firepower and protection than light tanks. Armor thickness sufficient to resist Finnish 37mm anti-tank guns at all but closest ranges. Despite these advantages, the T-28s proved vulnerable to Finnish defensive tactics, emphasizing close-range ambushes where heavier Finnish anti-tank weapons could penetrate armor, mines that could disable even heavy tanks, and Molotov cocktails targeting engine compartments and vision ports where fire could penetrate into crew compartments. The Soviet employment of T-28 tanks in frontal assaults against prepared Finnish positions resulted in heavy losses as tanks advanced without adequate infantry support into killing zones where Finnish defenders could engage with multiple weapons simultaneously. Combination of anti-tank guns, artillery fire, and infantry anti-tank weapons overwhelming Soviet armor through concentrated fire rather than through superior weapons capability. The Soviet artillery supporting ground operations included 152mm howitzers and 203mm heavy guns, capable of destroying even hardened fortifications through sustained bombardment. Thousands of Soviet artillery pieces firing preparatory bombardments before major assaults that delivered tons of high explosive onto relatively small areas of Finnish defensive lines. The psychological impact of sustained Soviet artillery fire created severe stress on Finnish defenders who had to endure hours of shelling in positions that provided protection against fragments, but that could not prevent concussive effects of near misses or direct hits on fortifications. Despite massive expenditure of ammunition, Soviet artillery achieved limited tactical success against well-constructed Finnish positions, concrete bunkers surviving even direct hits from heavy shells, while Finnish troops sheltering in deep bunkers and trenches remained capable of manning defensive positions once Soviet bombardment lifted and infantry assault began. Finnish defensive positions incorporated lessons from World War I trench warfare, adapted for Arctic conditions and mobile defense. Bunkers positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire covering approaches, while allowing defenders to shift between positions through communication trenches and tunnels. Obstacles channeling Soviet attacks into pre-sighted killing zones, and reserve positions allowing Finnish forces to conduct tactical withdrawals when positions became untenable while maintaining cohesive defensive line. The Finnish emphasis on small unit initiative allowed individual company and battalion commanders to adapt tactics to local conditions without waiting for orders from higher headquarters. Decentralized command structure proving more effective than Soviet centralized control that required approval from senior officers before tactical adjustments could be implemented. The Motti tactics that achieved spectacular success at Suomussalmi were replicated elsewhere along front, wherever Soviet forces advanced along narrow roads through forested terrain vulnerable to envelopment. Finnish ski troops moving through forest to attack Soviet column flanks and rear, while blocking forces cut roads at key points to isolate Soviet units from mutual support. The term Motti derived from Finnish word for stacked firewood, analogy reflecting Finnish tactic of cutting Soviet columns into segments that could be systematically destroyed like sections of woodpile. The effectiveness of Motti tactics depended on Finnish ability to operate in winter conditions that immobilized Soviet mechanized forces, ski troops maintaining mobility through deep snow, while Soviet vehicles remained road-bound and vulnerable to encirclement by forces that could maneuver cross-country through terrain that Soviet forces could not traverse. Soviet attempts to counter Finnish Motti tactics through deployment of ski troops met limited success, Soviet soldiers lacking training and equipment for effective winter warfare operations, while Finnish troops had lifetime experience operating in Arctic conditions. The Soviet ski troops that were deployed often proved ineffective against Finnish defenders who knew terrain intimately and who could operate for extended periods in conditions that Soviet troops found barely survivable. Combination of superior Finnish winter warfare skills and inadequate Soviet preparation, creating situation where Finnish forces maintained tactical mobility advantage despite Soviet numerical superiority. The Soviet recognition that winter conditions favored Finnish defenders led to renewed emphasis on frontal assaults against Mannerheim Line, where Soviet superiority in numbers and heavy weapons could be applied more effectively than in forest warfare, where Finnish tactics negated Soviet advantages. The Finnish Air Force operating obsolescent aircraft against superior Soviet numbers achieved remarkable success through aggressive tactics and exploitation of Soviet operational weaknesses. Finnish pilots flying Fokker DX fighters, intercepting Soviet bomber formations, and conducting hit-and-run attacks that disrupted Soviet air operations without attempting to achieve air superiority through sustained combat against numerically superior Soviet fighter forces. The Finnish anti-aircraft defenses around Helsinki and other key targets inflicted significant losses on Soviet bombers. Combination of accurate anti-aircraft fire and aggressive fighter interceptions making Soviet strategic bombing campaign costly in aircraft losses while achieving limited military results. The Finnish success in contesting Soviet air superiority demonstrated that numerical advantage in aircraft did not guarantee operational effectiveness when attacking force faced determined defense and when operational conditions, including weather and geography, favored defenders. The Soviet casualty figures from Winter War exceeded initial planning estimates by orders of magnitude. Total Soviet losses approaching 126,000 compared to Finnish losses of approximately 25,000. Casualty ratio of nearly 5-to-1, despite Soviet superiority in numbers and firepower reflecting effectiveness of Finnish defensive tactics and devastating impact of winter conditions on Soviet forces inadequately prepared for Arctic warfare. The Soviet casualties included significant numbers from frostbite and other cold weather injuries in addition to combat losses. Harsh winter conditions that Finnish forces had adapted to proving catastrophic for Soviet troops lacking proper equipment and training for operations in -40-degree temperatures. The high casualty figures combined with failure to achieve quick victory created political problems for Soviet leadership. International condemnation of Soviet invasion and League of Nations expulsion of Soviet Union, demonstrating diplomatic costs of military operation that had been expected to succeed rapidly with minimal casualties. The Soviet offensive renewed in February 1940 with massive concentration of forces against Mannerheim Line, Stalin having recognized that quick victory was impossible and that breakthrough on Karelian Isthmus required commitment of overwhelming force concentrated on narrow front, where Finnish defenders could not employ mobile tactics that had proven so effective in forest warfare. The Soviet 7th and 13th Armies, under command of General Semyon Timoshenko, launched coordinated assault employing over 500,000 troops supported by 3,000 artillery pieces and over 3,000 tanks. Firepower concentration exceeding anything previously seen in Winter War, and designed to simply overwhelm Finnish defensive positions through sustained application of explosive force that would destroy fortifications and break Finnish will to resist. The Soviet breakthrough achieved on Mannerheim Line in late February came after weeks of sustained bombardment and repeated assaults that gradually wore down Finnish defensive capabilities through attrition rather than through tactical superiority, Finnish forces running low on artillery ammunition and replacement troops, while Soviet forces could continuously feed fresh units into battle, replacing casualties with reserves that Finnish forces could not match. The breach of Mannerheim Line did not result in collapse of Finnish resistance, but rather in fighting withdrawal to secondary defensive positions, Finnish forces maintaining cohesion while conducting delaying actions that slowed Soviet advance and inflicted continuing casualties on attacking forces. Marshal Mannerheim recognized that continued resistance would eventually result in complete Finnish military collapse. Recommendation to Finnish government that peace negotiations offered better outcome than fighting to point of national destruction. The Moscow Peace Treaty, signed March 13, 1940, ended Winter War on terms unfavorable to Finland but preserving Finnish independence that had been Soviet objective at war's outset, Finland ceding Karelian Isthmus, including Viipuri and other territory totaling approximately 11% of Finnish land area, while maintaining sovereignty and avoiding occupation that Stalin had initially demanded. The Finnish survival as independent nation, despite overwhelming Soviet superiority, represented strategic defeat for Soviet Union, whose military performance had exposed serious weaknesses in Soviet armed forces, tactical incompetence, and inadequate preparation for winter warfare operations, creating casualties that approached those suffered by much larger nations in major World War I battles. The international perception that Soviet military was ineffective influenced German planning for Operation Barbarossa. Hitler, concluding that Soviet military weaknesses revealed in Finland indicated that rapid German victory over Soviet Union was achievable through application of superior German tactics and training. The technological lessons from Winter War emphasized importance of equipment designed for Arctic conditions, rather than attempting to adapt temperate climate equipment for cold weather operations. Soviet tanks and vehicles requiring specialized lubricants and starting procedures for -40-degree temperatures. Infantry needing proper winter clothing and equipment for survival, in conditions where inadequate preparation could result in catastrophic frostbite casualties within hours of exposure. The Finnish success with simple weapons like Molotov cocktails and ski troops demonstrated that tactical innovation and environmental adaptation could offset significant disadvantages in numbers and firepower. Low-tech solutions proving more effective than sophisticated weapons systems when employed by troops who understood local conditions and who could exploit terrain and climate advantages. The tactical lessons from Winter War regarding effectiveness of mobile defense and infiltration tactics influenced Finnish military planning for continuation war that began when Finland joined German invasion of Soviet Union in June 1941. Finnish forces employing same winter warfare skills and Motti tactics that had proven effective during Winter War to advance deep into Soviet territory during initial phases of Barbarossa. The Soviet military likewise learned lessons from Winter War debacle. Massive reforms of Red Army, including purge of incompetent officers and reorganization of tactical doctrine, emphasizing combined arms operations and proper preparation for winter warfare, improvements that would prove crucial when German invasion reached outskirts of Moscow in winter 1941, and Soviet forces successfully defended capital using tactics and equipment developed from Winter War experience. The Memorial to Finnish. Winter War defenders at Mannerheim Line stands testament to Finnish determination to resist invasion. Despite overwhelming odds, monument preserving memory of conflict, where small nation successfully defended independence against superpower neighbor through combination of tactical skill, environmental adaptation, and national will to resist regardless of cost. The preserved bunkers and defensive positions along former Mannerheim Line allow visitors to observe physical evidence of defensive works that channeled Soviet attacks into killing zones, where Finnish defenders could engage with maximum effectiveness, concrete fortifications, and anti-tank obstacles demonstrating how proper defensive preparation could partially offset advantages in numbers and firepower that attacking forces possessed. The Winter War's legacy in military history extends beyond specific tactical lessons to broader understanding of how environmental factors can dominate military operations as completely as force ratios or technological advantages. Arctic conditions that Finnish forces had adapted to proving catastrophic for Soviet forces inadequately prepared for operations in extreme cold. The demonstration that proper preparation and equipment for winter warfare were essential rather than optional influenced military planning throughout Cold War era, NATO and Soviet forces both developing specialized Arctic warfare capabilities, recognizing that conflicts in northern latitudes would require fundamentally different approaches than operations in temperate climates. The Finnish achievement of preserving independence despite Soviet invasion attempt demonstrated that determined defense employing tactics suited to local conditions could succeed even against numerically superior attackers, lesson that remained relevant for small nations facing potential aggression from larger neighbors. The Finnish ski troop tactics that proved so effective during Winter War influenced development of specialized mountain and Arctic warfare units in multiple armies during and after World War II. Recognition that soldiers trained and equipped for winter operations possessed capabilities that conventional infantry lacked in environments where snow and cold dominated tactical considerations. The Finnish white winter camouflage that made ski troops nearly invisible against snow backgrounds became standard equipment for Arctic warfare units. Combination of camouflage and mobility through snow, allowing small Finnish units to achieve tactical surprise against much larger Soviet forces that could not match Finnish cross-country mobility. The psychological impact of Finnish ski troops appearing seemingly from nowhere to attack and then vanishing back into winter landscape created constant insecurity among Soviet rear area forces, fear of ghost soldiers, degrading Soviet morale, and operational effectiveness, even when actual Finnish raids achieved relatively modest tactical results. The Soviet tank losses during Winter War, totaling over 3,000 destroyed or captured vehicles, represented catastrophic failure of mechanized warfare doctrine when applied in conditions for which forces were unprepared. Combination of inadequate crew training for winter operations, mechanical unreliability in extreme cold, and vulnerability to Finnish anti-tank tactics, creating situation where Soviet armor superiority became liability rather than advantage. The narrow forest roads that channeled Soviet armor into killing zones demonstrated importance of terrain analysis in mechanized operations, tactical considerations that were obvious in retrospect, but that Soviet planning had underestimated or ignored in expectation that numerical superiority would overwhelm Finnish resistance regardless of terrain constraints. The recovery of Soviet tanks by Finnish forces provided valuable equipment for Finnish army that had minimal armored forces at war's outset. Captured T-26 and BT-7 tanks being pressed into Finnish service where they provided mobile fire support that Finnish forces had previously lacked. The strategic implications of Winter War for broader World War II extended beyond direct military lessons to include diplomatic and political consequences that affected subsequent course of war. Soviet Union's weakened international standing following Winter War, contributing to German decision to invade Soviet Union while Soviet military appeared vulnerable. Miscalculation that would prove catastrophic for German forces when reformed Red Army demonstrated capabilities far exceeding what Winter War performance had suggested. The Finnish determination to preserve independence despite overwhelming odds impressed international observers and created sympathy for Finnish cause. Though this sympathy did not translate into material military support from Western powers that were focused on their own security concerns and that were unwilling to risk conflict with Soviet Union over Finland's fate. The comparison between Soviet performance in Winter War and subsequent Soviet performance during Great Patriotic War against Germany highlighted extent of Soviet military reforms implemented after Winter War disasters. Red Army that defended Moscow and eventually drove German forces back to Berlin bore little resemblance to poorly led and inadequately equipped force that had struggled against Finnish defenders in 1939 through 40. The Winter War experience provided brutal but valuable lessons for Soviet military leadership, revealing weaknesses in command structure, training, equipment, and doctrine that Soviet reforms addressed through massive reorganization and retraining programs implemented during brief period between end of Winter War and German invasion in June 1941. These reforms, while incomplete by time of Barbarossa, were sufficient to allow Soviet forces to avoid complete collapse during initial German onslaught. Soviet ability to trade space for time, while rebuilding forces owing much to lessons learned through costly Winter War experience. The Finnish perspective on Winter War emphasized national survival against overwhelming odds through combination of military skill, environmental adaptation, and determination to resist invasion regardless of cost. Finnish success in preserving independence, becoming source of national pride and military tradition that influenced Finnish defense policy throughout Cold War and beyond. The sacrifice of territory to preserve independence represented pragmatic acceptance of geopolitical reality, recognition that continued resistance would result in complete Finnish collapse and probable loss of independence that peace treaty avoided despite territorial concessions. Marshal Mannerheim's reputation as Finland's greatest military leader rested substantially on his leadership during Winter War. Strategic vision that recognized both capabilities and limitations of Finnish forces, allowing him to conduct defense that achieved maximum possible outcome given constraints of Finnish resources and Soviet superiority. The Winter War, when tiny Finland stopped Soviet giant through combination of tactical brilliance, environmental adaptation, and national determination, remains unique chapter in military history. Conflict where ski troops in white camouflage destroyed Soviet tank divisions, where soldiers outnumbered 5-1 successfully defended territory against invasion by superpower neighbor, and where Arctic warfare tactics defeated numerical superiority through exploitation of terrain and climate advantages that attacking forces could not overcome despite overwhelming material superiority. The frozen forests where Finnish snipers inflicted devastating casualties, the narrow roads where Soviet columns were encircled and destroyed through Motti tactics, and the Mannerheim Line bunkers where Finnish defenders held against sustained Soviet assaults serve as permanent reminders that military outcomes depend on more than just force ratios and technology, that proper preparation and adaptation to operational environment can create advantages sufficient to offset significant disadvantages in numbers and equipment. The equipment innovations that emerged from Winter War included not just tactical adaptations like Molotov cocktails, but also development of specialized winter warfare gear that became standard for Arctic operations in subsequent conflicts. Finnish experience demonstrating specific requirements for clothing, weapons maintenance, and vehicle operation in extreme cold that conventional military equipment did not address adequately. The Finnish success with simple but effective equipment contrasted sharply with Soviet reliance on sophisticated systems that failed in Arctic conditions, lesson about importance of reliability and environmental suitability over technological sophistication that remained relevant throughout development of military equipment for extreme environments. The Finnish soldiers' fur-lined boots, layered clothing systems, and ski equipment represented investment in basic capabilities that proved more valuable than heavy weapons or armored vehicles that could not operate effectively in conditions where mobility and cold weather survival were paramount considerations. The medical challenges of treating casualties in -40-degree conditions created unique problems that influenced development of combat medicine practices for Arctic operations, wounded requiring rapid evacuation to heated facilities where proper medical care could be provided, delay in treatment due to transportation difficulties or lack of heated facilities, potentially fatal even for relatively minor wounds that would be survivable in temperate conditions. The Finnish medical services developed protocols for maintaining body temperature of wounded during evacuation and treatment. Recognition that hypothermia represented threat as significant as combat injuries, leading to procedures emphasizing rapid warming and provision of heated shelter as soon as possible after wounding occurred. The Soviet medical services, less well prepared for Arctic conditions, suffered higher rates of preventable casualties from cold exposure during evacuation and treatment. Inadequate medical infrastructure for winter operations contributing to overall Soviet casualty figures that reflected not just combat losses, but also failures in medical support that proper preparation might have prevented. The psychological dimension of Winter War for both Finnish defenders and Soviet attackers highlighted how morale and unit cohesion affected combat effectiveness as much as material factors. Finnish troops defending homeland against invasion, maintaining determination despite heavy casualties and material disadvantages, while Soviet troops fighting in foreign country in brutal conditions with unclear objectives, experienced morale problems that degraded combat effectiveness. The Finnish advantage in motivation partially offset Soviet advantages in numbers and firepower. Soldiers willing to accept casualties and hardship when defending national survival fighting more effectively than soldiers whose commitment to campaign objectives was questionable. The Soviet recognition of morale problems led to increased emphasis on political indoctrination and harsher discipline, attempting to maintain unit cohesion through coercion rather than through cultivation of unit pride and patriotic motivation that sustained Finnish resistance. The international reaction to Winter War, including League of Nations' unprecedented expulsion of Soviet Union, represented rare instance of collective international condemnation of aggression. Though this condemnation did not translate into material support for Finland that might have altered war's outcome. The Western democracies' sympathy for Finland created awkward diplomatic situation, where nations fighting against Nazi Germany found themselves criticizing Soviet Union that would become crucial ally against Germany within 2 years. Complex geopolitical realities limiting extent of Western support for Finland, despite widespread public sympathy for Finnish cause. The Soviet Union's international isolation following Winter War contributed to subsequent German-Soviet tensions and to German decision that Soviet Union represented acceptable target for expansion. Miscalculation influenced by Soviet military performance that appeared to validate German contempt for Soviet military capabilities. The Winter War's place in Finnish national identity as moment when small nations successfully defended independence against overwhelming aggression remains central to Finnish self-conception and defense policy. Historical memory of Winter War, emphasizing both cost of defending sovereignty and necessity of maintaining credible defense capability that would deter potential aggressors. The Finnish policy of armed neutrality during Cold War drew directly from Winter War experience. Recognition that Finland could not rely on great power protection, requiring maintenance of military forces capable of making any invasion prohibitively costly, even if ultimate Finnish victory was impossible. The memory of Marshal Mannerheim's leadership and of individual Finnish soldiers' sacrifice during Winter War provided model for subsequent generations of Finnish military personnel. Tradition emphasizing tactical innovation, environmental adaptation, and determination to defend national independence regardless of odds. The legacy of Finnish Winter War extends beyond military and diplomatic history to include cultural impact that shaped Finnish national identity and international perception of Finland as nation willing to fight against impossible odds to preserve independence. David versus Goliath narrative resonating with audiences worldwide who admired Finnish determination and tactical brilliance against overwhelming Soviet superiority. The stories of individual Finnish soldiers like Simo Heiha, the legendary sniper, of Colonel Sailasvuo's victory at Suomussalmi, and of defenders at Kollaa holding against repeated Soviet assaults became part of Finnish national mythology. Examples of courage and skill that inspired subsequent generations and that demonstrated what determined defenders in proper conditions could achieve even against numerically superior attackers. The Winter War demonstrated conclusively that wars are won not just through superior numbers or technology, but through combination of tactical skill, environmental adaptation, national determination, and leadership that understands both capabilities and limitations of forces under command. Lessons that remain relevant for military planning in any era where potential conflicts might occur, in environments that challenge conventional military operations.